And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, the grand final. Let's give it up for the 4 teams that have made it to the final. Okay, without further ado, I'll now hand over to Tasneem, who's the Chief Adjudicator for this session of the evening. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the final. Before we start, can we give a round of applause to everyone who's made it this far for a wonderful achievement? Congratulations. The format of this debate, as you know, will be having 7-minute speeches. We have our wonderful today, Mr. Ian Lacey, who will be letting you know what those time signals are. After the first minute, you will hear a lovely bell. After the 6th minute, you will hear another lovely bell. And at the 7th, you will hear 2, which signifies the end of your speech. I'd like to actually introduce all the teams who've made it to the final. In opening government, we have Weill Cornell Medical College. In opening opposition, we have Qatar University. In closing government, we have Carnegie Mellon University. And in closing opposition, we have Georgetown. I'd also like to introduce you to the wonderful judges who will be judging this debate. We have Mr. Nazar Mukhtar, Ms. Eva Spoor, Ms. Madeline Hall, Ms. Maya Zimmerman, and Mr. Mohammed Abdurrahman. And I will be chairing this round. On the motion that this House believes that developing countries should prioritize economic development over civil political rights, I would like to introduce our Prime Minister for today from Cornell, Mr. Imad Alam. Here.
Adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to all of you. I'm Imad and I'm the first speaker from the side of the government. This House believes that developing countries should prioritize economic development over civil and political rights. Ladies and gentlemen, before I go on to talk about my points of substance, I'm going to clearly define the motion. But developing countries, we're talking about countries that have a low human development index as identified by the United Nations Organization and a per capita income of below $200 as defined by the UNO, which would include India, Pakistan, etc., etc. By prioritizing economic development, we mean these countries, which are mainly democratic countries in South Asia, should set 5-year goals, which should be set by the financial committee of the sitting parliamentarians, and they should strive to make policies that help them achieve these economic goals towards the end of these 5 years, right? Finally, by civil and political rights, we basically mean the right of the government to protect individuals' economic freedom and individual social and political freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, before I go on to my points of substance, let me make it very clear. We are not against individual freedom. We are not against civil and political rights. What we are telling you today is that, however, wherever there's a point when the country's economic benefit and individual rights of freedom clash, we would prioritize country's economic benefit over the individual's personal economic freedom, right? Not now. I didn't even come to my points yet. Ladies and gentlemen, so me and Zara are going to have 5 major points today. We're going to tell you why civil and political rights are secondary to economic development and why economic development of a country as a whole is essential to bring civil and political rights into the country. Number 2, we're going to talk about corruption and how it is rampant in the public sector. Number 3, we're going to talk about privatization and how it is the one way in which these countries can come out of the low economy. And last but not the least, Zara is going to talk about the long-term effects. Ladies and gentlemen, civil and political rights. So, ladies and gentlemen, this debate basically comes down to protecting a person's individual and economic rights versus the country's right as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're talking about, let me give you some analysis of these countries that we're talking about, developing countries, India, Pakistan, Burma, Myanmar, etc., right? Ladies and gentlemen, these are the countries that were colonized by the British Empire. These are countries that were under the rule by this massive British Empire, and about 50, 60 years ago, most of these countries got independence. After they got independence, what basically happened was that the landlords who ended up with a lot of land, with a lot of money, basically went on to rule their government, basically went on to make policies for this government. And ladies and gentlemen, they made policies for the benefit of their own families, for the benefit of their own particular kind of people, so they can have let me just finish this point and then I'll take you. So they can protect their own interests over the interests of the public economy as a whole. As a result of this, due to this, we see that when you're talking about tax distribution in these countries, it is unequal. Due to this, we see there's a lot of corruption in the public sector. So ladies and gentlemen, we feel this is wrong, and we feel there should be economic goals that should be set by the sitting parliamentarians democratically elected by the people of those particular states to set feasible economic goals that would empower the entire country and all the individuals rather than these few people who own the industries and who own the public sector properties. For example, in most countries of South Asia now, if you look at industries like coal, mining, etc., they're owned by people who are extremely rich, who are landlords, who already have money, and they make policies that help protect the interests of the individual people. So for example, they say everyone should pay 10% tax, rather than saying that the rich people who earn more than $1 million a year should pay 25% tax, and the poor people who earn less than $100,000 a year should give 5% tax, because that's just fair, right? You take money from the rich and divert it to the poor. Yes, I will take you.
Okay, these type of landlords will be more supported through economic development when there is no responsibility or accountability in terms of political incivility.
Exactly. Accountability. Exactly. They're talking about accountability, right? Let's look at what accountability. That was my second point, right? About the corruption that's rampant in the public sector. So today we have most of these rich landlords, these rich people have inherited all these lands, ruling all these big industries and monopolizing them. And what accountability do they have? Most of the industries that are suffering right now, electricity. There's a lot of load shedding in Pakistan, in India, in Burma. Why is that? Because these so-called public sector government countries are not accountable to any particular individual, right? Because it's a public sector, it's a public government. There's not one individual who's responsible for this. It's the entire government as a whole. As a result, whenever the parliament sets apart a particular budget, let's say 5 million rupees for the development of electricity, a lot of this money goes into the pockets of these rich landlords rather than being used for this electricity. Which we think is essentially wrong, which we think is corruption, which we think is keeping the country to grow as a whole. However, what this is doing is that it is empowering only a particular section of the people and only a particular section of the society, which is this rich people. On the other hand, we say if you adopt the model that was given to you by the East Asian tigers, which is Singapore, Malaysia, etc., what they essentially did was they brought privatization. They let private industries, private companies that have been well established in various parts of the world to come into their countries, right, and set up industries and take hold of all these public sector industries. So they basically transferred the industries that were previously in the public sector to the private sector. What that did was, essentially, it led to more checks and balances and it led to more accountability. What it basically said was, there is this person who was the head of the Mittal Industries, and he's responsible for the efficiency and for the profits. And due to that, because it's a private sector industry now, not a public sector industry now, you have more profits because it's the name of an industry that is at stake. It is the name of Mr. Mittal, who happens to be a billionaire today, which is at stake. So therefore, the productivity of these industries increase, the efficiency of these people increase, and therefore we have seen Malaysia, Singapore, etc. increase their economic development. Yes, I'll take you quickly.
So do you think that it's in fact having these feudal laws and certain localized powers that prevents the country from developing as a whole?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're talking about developing countries, yes, and I've provided you enough analysis and I've shown you how through the years and years of time after the British left the country, most of these resources are still in this few rich people, right? Ladies and gentlemen, talking about civil and political rights, me and Zara are for civil and political rights. We think civil and political rights are important. We think an individual economic freedom is important, but we feel it comes into play and it is important only after the country has been strengthened as a whole. Only after all this money that is currently being monopolized by these rich people has been transferred more or less equally to the entire country, has been diverted to resources and has been led to lead by these private industries and private sectors that will make sure that there is profit, that will make sure that there is efficiency, that will make sure that there are more jobs for the unemployed, because now guess what, you have more profit and you have more efficiency, therefore you create more jobs, therefore you divert the resources to something that's feasible and something that's proper and something that's democratic, and most of these countries are indeed democratic, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, what have I told you today? I've given you an analysis of how the power and wealth distribution in most developing countries is. I've given you a comparison between Singapore and Malaysia on one hand, who prefer their economic development, and on the other hand, countries like India and Pakistan, who still are being ruled by these feudal laws in terms of their power and energy sectors, right? I've shown you how privatization will help tackle all this. And finally, I've shown you that civil and political rights are important and individual economic freedom is important. However, is it more important than the country's economic freedom as a whole? No. And we have also shown you how, by privatizing these industries and taking this power and wealth away from these rich people and distributing it fairly to the people by way of privatization, is the only way to tackle economy, thereby leading to a good civil and political structure in the years to come. And my friend Zahra will talk about the long-term effects of what I've said right now. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech, and I'd like to call our first speaker from opposition. We have Haider. Here.
Problem, solution, outcome. What is the problem? There is lack of accountability, there is corruption, people are not getting paid because the top echelon of the government are putting all the money in their pockets from the budget that is supposed to be for the people, right? So there is some kind of economic platform there, and there is a democratic country where people have a right to say, or people have a say in the government, right? Yet people are still finding corruption, right? These are the problems that side government has conceded to. What is the outcome? What do we want to achieve? We want people to get the money. We want people to get benefit. What is their solution? Privatization. Why? How? We don't know, Madam Speaker. We get no solution. We just get this jump, right? If we privatize, people will get money. There will be trickle-down effect. People will be happy. We don't know how that happens, Madam Speaker, and I doubt if they do also, right? Because privatization is not the solution. The solution is to focus on the civil and the political rights of the people in these countries, right? These are rights we're talking about. We're not talking about corrupt politicians who want to make even more ways, sit down, who want to make more ways of putting more money in their pocket. We want people to focus on the right, and that is the solution, as we will prove to you why and how, right? Now, he's talking about that this is individual right versus country's right. Madam Speaker, we do find that it might be the case. However, when we focus on this individual right of the people, and we focus on how the overall effect of focusing on civil and political rights will occur, we will find that overall the social benefit for the whole country will also prosper, Madam Speaker. And that's what we'll prove to you. Have a seat. No, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. Okay. Now, before I move on, I would like to signpost. So I'll be talking about the political right, and basically how the lack of accountability and responsibility is the main cause and how we will solve it. And my partner will talk about the lack of civil rights, how it gives rise to exploitation of labor, and how modernization theory, which is what they're proposing, has failed, right? So, out to my points, right? Now, lack of accountability and responsibility, right? Let me just reiterate what the government has said. They said that there are politicians, that this is a democracy, they have an economic platform, they have a budget, however, there's corruption. So how can we really take a look at this and try to solve this, decrease of this corruption, right? Because what is happening? In these countries, there is trade, there is raw materials, there is trade going on between these countries and outside, right? China and Myanmar. Myanmar is benefiting a lot from the trade with China, right? From raw materials, from gems or whatever, right? So there is trade occurring. It's not like there's a lack of raw materials or lack of resources that these people are living impoverished, right? So what is the issue here? That the people are living impoverished because there's no trickle-down effect because of corruption. How do we solve this?
Point, sir.
Give people more political rights. What do we mean by political rights? The ability to hold people accountable, the ability to have a say in political actions of the country, and that way you have these political corrupted figures who can be held accountable, and with time they can be kicked out of their position to be replaced by somebody who is more honest, to be replaced by somebody who will not put the money in their pockets, as Ahmad has said, right? So why do we want to focus on political? Why do you want to focus on political rights, right? Number one, these are rights we're talking about, right? Especially since these are democracies, as he set the limit to, right? These are democracies, so these people already have the right to have a say in the politics of the government. Yet we find that not happening because there's corruption. But when we increase the protection of these rights, especially the political rights, we will have accountability. We will have people who can say, you're doing this wrong, you're doing it bad, you're stealing our money. There is no trickle-down effect. I'm still living poor. Even when there's trade, even though there's money coming in the country, fix it, and I'll force you to fix it because I have the ability to do so. Okay, because he yelled. Yes.
Don't you see how these really powerful people use these civil and political rights to their own advantage by preventing privatization, by preventing equal wealth distribution?
Take a seat, please. Okay, now I don't know how they try to have equal distribution, especially when you said there's corruption. And I don't see how these are taking political responsibility to their own accord, because, Madam Speaker, they just stated that these democracies are facing corruption. So we already know that there is no political rights. The political rights are being tampered with here, and the political rights are not being given to the people, right? And what we say, we should enforce the political rights of the country. We should make people more aware of their political rights so that they can have a stronger say in the country, so that they can have a stronger opinion in the political actions of the country, right? So why is this a solution, the proper solution, right? Because, Madam Speaker, when a member of the society, of the democratic society, right, when they have a stronger say in their the political situation of the country, right? We find that these people are actually being treated as people, not as items or as labor or as these things that the people use, the corrupted are used to get more money out of them through trade and whatever, and put it more into their pockets, right? So when people are more aware of their political rights, this exploitation will stop,
sir.
right? Now, how will this have an effect on the economic growth for the whole nation, right? So when you have there's not just one individual who has sit down. There's not just one individual who has the political right. Okay, we talk about the whole country, everybody in the nation, right? So this in itself is how the whole country is being affected in a positive way, right? By raising awareness. Moreover, how will that have an effect on the economic growth of the country when you have people who are more aware of the political rights and that can change the corrupt system that is occurring, right? Less money will go into the logically, less money will go into the pockets of the corrupted people because they've been replaced by more honest people. They know that there are people watching them and that they cannot be as corrupted as they were in the past, right? And that is why and focusing on the political rights is important, Madam Speaker, right? It reduces the corruption. Now, what does that have the effect on the overall nation, Madam Speaker? We see that the economic growth is more solid. It's not just numbers on paper. Oh yeah, this country has GDP growth. In that case, they're good. No, Madam Speaker, we see a more solid, more pure economic growth where there is an actual trickle-down effect. Why will there be a trickle-down effect? Because the corruption, the embezzlement of money in the country will decrease. More people get the benefits. More people gain the benefits, and that could even spill over to the social benefits like healthcare or welfare that could occur for the society, right? Because now we have more money to work with, Madam Speaker, and all this because of the political factors alone, let alone the civil factors, which my partner will talk about, right? So what have we told you, Madam Speaker? In the first case, Madam Speaker, we said that these democracies or that privatization, we don't see how this will be the solution to the problem. It is not the solution to the problem because it fixes nothing. It just increases the corruption that's already occurring as conceded, and that having more political awareness and more political power and stronger political rights is the way to create a change in the country, create a change in the political situation of the country, and that way you can solve corruption, you can increase the trickle-down effect, and you can have people who have rights and have a better life, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech, and I'd like to call our second speaker from Opening Government, Ms. Zahra Naqvi. Here.
Ladies and gentlemen, in any developing nation, I concede that civil and political rights are important. But what is the root of every civil and political distrust and disestablishment in any developing nation? And that is because there is economic instability, ladies and gentlemen. And what do we need to do to fight against economic stability is allow these nations to recognize that this is the flaw in the model. And we have to address this flaw head on. And how do we address this? On side government, we say that we need to tackle this as a priority. We need to place this above every other issue that is happening in a developing nation and allow us to focus all of our resources towards a one main goal. And what am I going to be telling you? First of all, in my points of substance, is how in the long term, this is the only way to affect change in the society, both on the level of civil rights as well as economic development, and from moving from a developing nation to a more developed nation. But before I start, I'm going to start with some points of rebuttal. So side opposition here came up and explained to us why corruption is bad. Ladies and gentlemen, we agree corruption is bad. And we say that there is no room for civil or political rights for that poor man in a corrupt government. And how do we tackle this corrupt government, ladies and gentlemen, is by breaking up their monopolies and allowing individuals to take part in this previously single-handedly owned entity to be open to the rest of the nation. And how do we do that? As Imad has explained, by privatization. We say we do not allow individuals to suffocate the market because they have ownership from decades. We say that we need to break past this glass ceiling. And how do we do this? By taking their government, by taking their companies that they earned from their forefathers and saying, no, this is not your right because your last name is so and so. We say that this is the right of the people of this nation, and to develop this nation, you you need to forego this monopoly and allow others to grow. And how do we do this? We've seen this already, seen how this is effective, how privatization is helpful, how economic development as the main goal is effective. And where have we seen this? We've seen developing nations such as Singapore and Malaysia become developed nations when the government recognized that the publicly owned businesses were doomed, that they recognized a flawed system. They acted. And how did they act? They said that we are going to find the gurus of these businesses. We're going to figure out who are the smartest individuals to run these businesses, and we are going to employ them into this project and move towards economic development. And soon all these ideas of petty theft and robbery and civil unrest were no longer present. And why were they no longer present? Because the poor were no longer as poor. And why were they no longer as poor? Is because they were now being employed. They were now being put forth into developing their nation. They had this idea of collectivism, of a common goal, and that they could move forward from here. And where were they moving forward? To becoming one of the most developed nations in the world. And that is what side government wants you to believe. And I'm going to show you how long-term effects are going to be like this. We're showing you how this is a self-fulfilling cycle. If you allow economic development above civil development, what do? You give jobs, and to whom do you give the majority of these jobs? To the youth. Those individuals that would currently be unemployed, sitting around angry at their government for being corrupt, as side opposition have shown. But instead of fighting, you employ them. You give them ability to harbor change. And by doing this, these individuals are working towards a goal. They bring home money. They are allowed to go to Baskin Robbins and feed their children. They are allowed to eat out and sometimes feel happy about what's going on, except instead of thinking about where's my next meal coming from? Why is he corrupt? I want to be the next president of this country. I know where this is going to go. We say that no, small steps, and you allow your country to grow eventually. And how do you allow your country to grow? You allow these individuals to take ownership in what they do. They soon feel part of this country that was initially developing and are now seeing that this can be a developed nation. And then you reap these benefits. And how do you reap these benefits? You reap the benefits of a booming economy, because eventually your economy will boom. And why will it boom? Because now you are employing a previously unemployed section of your nation and moving these citizens to becoming active members of your society. And then once you have a booming economy, where does that lead you? You allow yourself in 5 years, in 10 years to reap these benefits by pumping this money and investing back in your citizens. And you start again from the grassroots level. You increase education. You allow this money that there has been to increase infrastructure, to move towards a goal of development, which is the goal of any developing nation. I'll take opening quickly.
Madam, why do you think they will pump it into infrastructure if they can just put it into their pockets when they're just corrupt government still?
The premise of their argument is that all developing nations' governments are corrupt, and the only way to fight them is by sitting in a room and writing out legislature about how to overthrow a corrupt government. And on side government, we say that this is completely flawed, and there is no way you can lead from one to the next, and then how this is going to take it apart. So then again, let me bring down what we have told you today in this argument. There are 3 main points and 2 main points from Imad. The first main point is that economic development is essential for civil development. And why is this essential? The link is that the civil unrest is based upon the fact that these individuals are feeling angry and they're hostile to their government, and they do not see any ends to their means besides having civil unrest. And if you allow them to be taken in and be developed, that will lead to decreased civil unrest. And that is what we need to prioritize. Then second of all, how this is going to be a self-fulfilling cycle of efficiency. In the long term, you will reap the benefits of investing initially on economic development as opposed to civil development, and then reap those benefits. And then how corruption, although rampant in the developing world, the only way to tackle it is by allowing privatization of these companies and moving away from monopolies and into a booming economy. And then lastly, that although although civil political rights are important, that we need to tackle economic development to eventually move from a developing nation to a developed nation, and that should be the goal of any economy. And for all these reasons, we beg you to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech, and I'd like to call our next speaker from opening opposition, Mr. Muhammad Shaheen. Here.
before I move on to my substantive arguments that lack of civil unions or rights give rise to exploitation of labor, the so-called youth who are sitting idle. Number two, how modernization theory has failed in the current context, and I'll be proving you, and how privatization, which the solution they were giving, is the worst thing that can happen in those developing countries, Madam Speaker, because of the rampant corruption which they agreed to. Okay, before I move on, I would like to deal with what they have thrown here. Okay, there is economic stability is the problem. It's not. Economic stability comes after. When you have a stable country where there is security, when there is more safe environment for investors, that's when you get more foreign direct investment, Madam Speaker. That's when your country will grow in terms of international level, Madam Speaker. So they think that it's not important to have it, but no, it's the other way around. Now I'll be dealing with how corruption. They think that the corruption is not a problem. They agree to it. If you just look at the Transparency International level of corruption, all these developing countries that you're talking about fits in the category that they have rampant corruption, Madam Speaker. So let's think about it, okay? We have corrupt government in developing countries, all right? Then what you do is that you privatize the economy. What do you do mean by privatize the economy? With less civil and political rights. With less civil and political rights means there is lack of accountability and responsibility. What does the corrupt government will do in terms of this, Madam Speaker? Are they going to be the best people and give the right to the tender to a best company which they can have? No, Madam Speaker. What they're going to do is that they're going to monopolize the government, which they said will breaking up, but in turn they will be creating more monopolies, Madam Speaker. By how? By giving tenders, which they can, because there is less civil and political rights for the people in terms of decision making and accountability, Madam Speaker. No, thank you. And you know, the self-fulfilling and taking the employment opportunity, I'll be tackling in the exploitation of labor part, Madam Speaker. So we have tackled what they have go for. They're not breaking up monopolies. They're creating monopolies in the corrupt government. So let's go to my substantive arguments. Okay, before I move on, Narcissus, yeah.
You can't really get civil and political rights unless you have economic stability.
No.
Don't you think that this...
No, I never said that. That's a misunderstanding. I said the opposite. When you don't have a civil and politically stable country, there will not be investment coming in country, so that it will be detrimental for the economy, Madam Speaker. So they got it wrong. Okay.
Point, sir.
No, thank you. Oh, so lack of give rise to exploitation of labor. What is civil society, Madam Speaker? It's something above family and something beyond government, Madam Speaker. So if you look at these developing countries, there is a lack of this civil society, and what they're calling for is that give them less priority. What does giving less priority means? That there will be companies which will be held less accountable. For example, if you have a country, your workers are not able to union or create a union for themselves, and those youth who are sitting idle can buy, KFC or whatever they want, but that's not going to happen, Madam Speaker, because they're going to be exploited. They're going to be exploited because they will be given less salary than the minimum wage.
Point, sir.
Because the country or the corrupt government are creating these monopolies by giving away tenders, which are not in the right way because they are corrupt, and they have taken that argument. Okay, and they will be exploited because they will be less powerful, because with unity comes power, Madam Speaker. So when we give less priority to civil and political rights in those developing countries which have rampant corruption, what it leads to is that more and more exploitation, and this will have detrimental effect on the economy, because what you need for your economy is the human capital, Madam Speaker. Human capital is the basis of any developing economy, and if you are doing this, and the perfect example would be of China, Madam Speaker. What are they? They gave the importance to economic development, Madam Speaker, and they gave less importance to their civil and political rights. What are they experiencing now, Mr. Speaker? Madam Speaker, they are having less and more people are being died out of their suicide, because they are not being able to under bad condition, because they don't have union, because they want economic development. In my second argument, I will be talking why this is the really bad thing to do, because take your seat, because it will have detrimental effect on the country. So what they are arguing is for modernization theory. The theorists back then, they thought that what will bring change to the country is that when you have economic development, with it comes social and political development. But we have proven the opposite, Madam Speaker. It doesn't work. Why it doesn't work? We come into the vicious cycle of underdevelopment. Why do we come into the vicious circle? Let's look at this. Economic development. The economy is in the hands of few. How? They create the monopolies. How do they create monopolies? This whole system of corrupt people, or the landlords they were talking about, are still part of the country, all right? Then there is less priority given to the political and civil right in terms of their decision-making capability and their ability to make unions. So what do they have here? They have more favoritism working towards state building, or it's give rise to what it's called state corporatism, Madam Speaker. State corporatism, and that it did work, right? So there's no problem. But it worked only in few countries, which you said was Asian magic. Even the theorists or the people in the world who are intellectual calls it a magic because it doesn't happen anywhere. So we cannot ever generalize for this corrupt government, Madam Speaker. So it's out of context of this debate, Madam Speaker. So why is it detrimental for social development? Because what happens is that when you have a country where it's economically, controlled by few people, and they have the resources, okay, and then you have the people underneath them, which are socially and politically and civically, deteriorated in terms of their rights. This gives rights of power imbalance in that society, and this will create more imbalance in terms of society. So it had worked only in the few cases, and other cases we cannot generalize because it proved to be wrong, Madam Speaker. And let's look at the privatization, which they think it will be the best one. It is not, Madam Speaker. If you just look at the case of Africa, which is a resource-rich or mineral-rich continent, Madam Speaker, they have gone through as much as privatization as these guys can imagine. The mining industry, their natural resource industry, everything is under privatization. What is the effect, Madam Speaker? They are shipping off the profit to the UK and the US or something. And what do they have? The people there, they're getting poorer and poorer, Madam Speaker. So this is the worst thing that these people or developing countries can have in terms of their economic development strategy, Madam Speaker. So this is never going to help them in terms of their economic development. What it will have more is the societally weak, because they were deprived of because economic development is given priority. That means that their social and political rights will be given less, Madam Speaker. So they will be less in terms of political decision making, and they will be having less in terms of their making unions to call for their side. So we have told you for all those reasons that lack of civil union give rise to exploitation. Modernization theory has failed, and privatization is the worst thing that they could ever have. For all those reasons, we are proud to.
Here.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech, and to kick off closing, I'd like to invite Mr. Tariq Hariri. Here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So my extension is going to be highly focused on the moral and importance of implementing this motion, as opposed to the opening's focus on the practical aspects of implementing this. In other words, the how to implement this motion. We on side closing government are going to differentiate ourselves by clearly demonstrating why there is a basic necessity for this motion to be implemented and why this needs to be implemented as opposed to how. All right. So now before that though, I want to give a couple of brief rebuttals on the opening side of opposition and why they have not understood why this is important as opposed to how. All right. So first they came up and started speaking about how giving more political rights is going to resolve the corruption of people. By having more political rights being distributed around the system, there's going to be a resolve in the corruption. However, they're also saying that there's going to be some sort of working with money to resolve this issue. As was across the bench, they say the more money that is going on, we're going to be able to have better focus to resolve this issue. But what our main focus is, how are we possibly going to be able to resolve this issue using money if we're having a failing economic system within the country in and of itself? All right. They started speaking more and more about the political rights. However, they overlooked something basically simple, which I would be surprised they would overlook, which is something called human rights that are actually being violated within that country as it is. All right. They're forgetting that there is a corruption because of the lack in the business laws. It's not because of the lack in the civil rights. The corruption that is actually occurring within the developing countries is because of the laws that are currently possessed the business as opposed to the people. No, thank you. And they started speaking about how there's a trickle-down effect, how they're getting civil rights. Really, but this isn't actually how we think it's going to go. How do we think it's going to go? Well, basically, here's the idea. All right, companies are tied to the civil union because what they're saying is that they're going to become dying because of the bad conditions. correct? So they're saying that people are dying because of bad conditions that are existent within these areas. However, that's not tied to the civil unions as they wanted to tie it. It's actually tied to a lack of alternatives already existent within that country. Because there isn't any other choice but to work in that coal mine, they have to go and work in that coal mine as opposed to going and working for some other institution that could have been established through privatization. What they're saying is that and they even stated, and this is quoted by the second speaker of opening opposition, what we need is human capital. That's not fully what we need at this point. What we really need is the understanding of the human rights. All right? And this is actually what we're speaking of. And this brings me straight to my extension. All right? The opposition has demonstrated that they are not aware of how businesses should operate, as opposed to the civil political rights. All right? We're talking about civil rights here, ladies and gentlemen, along with some political rights, but the idea is these are two intertwined things. We're talking about things such as sexual orientation. We're talking about things such as a female's role within society. We're speaking of children, the treatment of children. We're not speaking of many of these things. This is what, when it's said of civil rights, this is what the context is. This is not our main concern within developing countries. All right? We firmly believe that human rights are far more greater and more important at this point than civil rights. Let's see if this is opposition's view. All right? What's more important to them? Getting food on a person's table or having the civil right to be homosexual? At this point, this isn't even an argument. We need to make sure everyone is eating within the society to even determine whether or not they can be homosexual. All right? The lack of rights that is being attributed to the society is for one reason, because there is a weakness and a failure within the system of economics within that country. It is because this link, no, thank you. It is because there is a link to because there's not as many people having money in the lower standard, the normal people, but the higher ranks of people, the more rich top notches of society, have the money and can exploit with it. This isn't something that's going to be solved through political rights. This is going to be solved through giving people more money by developing the economy. How so? Well, we believe that progression doesn't happen through civil political movements as the engine. What is always the engine in every sort of system? It's always economics. Economics is the core way to get to a better solution. And this is why we think that these economic conditions are going to bring about civil political rights. I'll take Arwa.
So, sir, are you undermining all the potential of the civil rights?
We're not undermining. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I can already understand what she's going to say. We're undermining civil and political and all these sort of things. We're not undermining them. We're saying the more important thing at this point is making sure kids are surviving, as opposed to the father having a choice whether or not he wants to be homosexual or whether or not his wife has the choice to vote when their son is dying from malnutrition. We have to make sure everyone is eating and everyone is having the proper rights to bring this sort of stability. Let me give you the case of Rwanda. Since they keep speaking of civil and political and these sort of things, Rwanda currently has a parliament that has minorities involved, that has women involved, that has men involved. It's almost a perfect civil institution for its case. But guess what? They don't have enough economic development to actually implement their solutions. So that's why they're still failing. All right? But let's look at another case. In this case, the United States. The United States had economic turbulence for many generations. All right? And this is why, for some reason, they weren't able to possibly get their civil political rights until when? Until they started stabilizing themselves economically. Only today do we begin to hear of things such as homosexual rights, or do we hear of things such as women's rights, or all these other civil political issues. Why? Because they resolved the economic things. Granted, economics is always turbulent and they are within their own recessions. But the main thing to focus on is that they resolve themselves economically, then they focus on the civil and political rights. Because no rights can come about without the economic condition that would be the sort of usher forth for them. Yes?
But at the end of the day, we have already all agreed to there is rampant corruption, and whatever you're doing in economic stability.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. He thinks that the rampant corruption is going to be somehow unresolved through the economic conditions, but we've already stated that there's many sort of solutions as opposed to this sort of thing. By having more alternatives present within the society, it's not like the top notch are going to be able to control all of this privatization company. No, by having many sort of companies that are interested in investing in this sort of area, not investing in civil, but investing in economic development, then there are actually going to be a wider array of choices. There's not going to be as much of a chance to exploit these workers. Suddenly, these workers don't have to go and lose an arm in the coal field, in the coal mines. Instead, they can go and they can work on telephones, speaking sort of similar to what's happening in India. All right, these sort of things are the basis of how to improve the society. All right, and so basically, what we're saying in our extension is the following: that we need to be focusing more on economic development, because economic development is critically more important at this case, not in general, but in this situation, which is the developing country trying to get itself to a developed country. We're trying to make sure they have the necessary resources to get to that stage. Civil and political rights, while important as the economic rights, are the sort of things that will be ushered forth through the economic development. That is why we think that these sort of situations, such as the United States, is a perfect example of how these sort of systems go. The United States was at one point a developing country, and now it is considered a developed country. Why is that? Because they set down the necessary foundation to get themselves economically stable, and then they started working on black rights. Then they started working on women rights. Then they started working on homosexual rights. And they're going to continue to be working on civil and political issues that are going to continue to arise. We can't be always focusing on civil and political while we're having our children starving. So for all of these reasons, we beg you to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his speech and call on our first speaker from Closing Government, Ms. Aylin Francis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to delve right into our extension. We believe that the very unique nature of development in developing countries makes it necessary for us to prioritize civil and political rights, and that this is the only way to ensure complete and self-sustaining development in developing countries. And I'll show you why this is the case through my substantives. But before that, I'd like to address the arguments brought up by side government thus far. So, side government believes that it's feudalism and the inability of participatory governance that sort of keeps developing countries poor. And this is what we heard from opening government. And yes, our solution was yes, make political rights more pervasive so that people can participate in political decision making. So I think that's a win for us. Thank you for that. And then they said that, well, the thing to do is there's nothing that a poor man can do in a corrupt world. That's true. But also remember that's very little a rich man can do in a corrupt world unless he's unless he's part of the political elite, unless he's part of he's part of the cronyism that's so prevalent in the country, and so that sort of falls down. And then they said, well, as long as they can reap benefits that privatization brings in, there is no problem. But they're assuming that the sole goal of private organizations is to redistribute their profits, which it's not. Private organizations are driven by profits, and whatever profits they make, they keep. They have no social goal to redistribute it among the poor people. On the other hand, the government does, which is why we're going to tell you why your policy is wrong. And then the closing came up and very easily made a distinction between human rights and civil rights. And we're appalled by this distinction, to say the least. I'm going to take up the example of the United States that they were so fond of, and they said, well, the US focused on economic rights, and so everything sort of worked out, and then they focused on civil and political rights. Ladies and gentlemen, let's go do some US history here. So they had some sort of, they had slave labor, and the economy was based on slave labor, and they were doing quite okay for some time, but it wasn't sustainable. Not everyone was happy, and there was revolt, and what they realized that economic development is not sustainable unless everyone in society has the ability to participate using political rights and civil rights. And so you have the civil rights movement in the US, and after that they started developing. So a good example there. And we think that Rwanda is sit down. We think Rwanda is making tremendous progress. We appreciate the efforts they have made, especially given their history. And we think that if you've given the US 300 years to reach where they are today, give Rwanda at least a decade. They just got out of a genocide. So we appreciate the effort that they have made. So yes, that brings down the arguments that they've brought. Now, ladies and gentlemen, moving into my own substantives. One, I'm going to show you the very unique nature of why development is important at all, number one. Two, I'm going to show you why it's unique in developing countries. And three, I'm going to show you why sustainability of development is of critical nature. First, I'll start off with why developing is important. Ladies and gentlemen, economic development is not just about raising your GDP or all that. It is about all-inclusive growth. It is about targeting every member of your society. It is about realizing that so long as if you have few private companies that are really rich, you're doing okay. You're not doing okay. We want to point out the significance of all-inclusive development. And you want to pull everyone out of poverty. And why should you, in fact, pull everyone out of poverty? Because if you have some people who are unable to participate in the economy, unable to really give their best because they are in poverty, your process of development is not sustainable because they are not able to contribute to the economy. Sit down. You're not able to contribute to the economy. So we think that it should be all-inclusive. And how can you make sure that you are pulling everyone out of poverty with political rights, with civil rights? We think it's important for you to be able to elect your own government. We think it's important for you to be able to important for you to be able to have access to civil rights like education, like healthcare, so that you can actually contribute to the economy. We do not want some sections of society to be excluded, and we think some sections of society will be excluded if they are unable to set in a governance structure that assures that everyone in the country has equitable access to civil and political rights. Sit down. And so we'd like to bring in the example of Russia. Everyone remembers Soviet Russia, where you had an illegitimate government that supported a minority, a clique of the elite who continued to support the government. And so you had a vicious cycle where the government propped up the elite and the elite propped up the government, and everyone else suffered, died, and they stayed in poverty, and that did not work. So that's pretty much what they want. They don't want the people to have the right to affect their government, to change their government, and they want some private elites to continue propping up an illegal government, and we think that's horrible. Why not?
You realize that once the people have the necessities to live, they will start moving for civil and political rights. We're not saying abolish it, we're saying prolong it until the time is right.
Absolutely, but you have not been able to prove that they have access to these civil and to these basic rights. We've shown you that private companies, your golden standard, have no incentive to take care of the ordinary citizen. Their incentive is to drive profits. Their incentive is to pay the lowest wages, do as little as they can, and keep profits for themselves. So I don't see how the redistribution mechanism is working out. Sit down. And in fact, what they want is an idea of feudalism, and we are opposed to it. Now, moving on to my second argument. What is unique about developing countries? Ladies and gentlemen, developing countries rely on investment for their development. This is not just investment from outside, but also from within the countries. In fact, a recent World Bank report has showed that most savings in developing countries flow outside. And why is that the case? Because of political instability. The people in the country know that if they invest in this country is very much prone to political instability, because the governance structure is not representative, because the government is not taking care of everyone. So people have a disincentive to invest in this country, because any other day you can have a strike and all your investment it goes to waste. So we think that by in fact prioritizing civil and political rights, you're making the country more stable, less prone to political strike, less prone to civil conflict, and thus encouraging more investment to come into the country. Without political rights and civil rights, the country is less stable, and hence they're less likely to get investment from home and abroad. More importantly, by upholding civil rights, you uphold this there is an international rally for upholding civil rights and human rights. By upholding these human rights, you receive international consensus in the community. And so we think that this will further make your country seem like a good country and further encourage investment into the country. And we've shown you, and it also means that by investing in healthcare and by investing in education, your development is sustainable. It's not something that the government does on a one-off basis. It's something that the people can continue to do because they have good healthcare, they have good governance, they have good education to continue developing forever. For these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech, and I'd like to call on our final speaker from the government bench. We have Ms. Narcis Sadat.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Coming to the end of this debate, we bring you three clash points. Which comes first, civil and political stability or economic development, versus the other way around, which side opposition has tried to, which is the other way around, which we have tried to argue in this debate. Also, we're going to tell you where does economic exploitation and corruption less likely to occur, and we propose that it's where you have more stable economic condition. And finally, where are the people of the country better off? And this is what the main focus of the debate should be about, and this is what my partner has talked about. So first of all, let's start by pinpointing something that Hidr said. He thinks civil and political rights are bigger than econ rights. And we think there's a fundamental problem with that, because the same way Tara has told you, we tell you that there's a lot less chance for you to be worried about getting a right to be gay, for instance, when you don't have food on the table. And we've talked about these countries, as Ahmad has pointed out.
India, Pakistan, where people are extremely poor, they're less likely to focus on these issues if they don't have the food on the table. Elon has told us that this should be an inclusive process, so this should not be about GDP. Well, I fail to understand how this is not about GDP, because the most reflective instrument of you to evaluate how people are doing, how people are developing, is through the GDP. If everybody is okay on GDP basis, if everybody has enough income, then we can move on to getting them rights, because we think they are worthy. And let's also clarify one point. We are not against civil rights. We're saying there should be priorities. And where should be priorities, we think that these priorities of the people also align with our priorities. We think that the country wants to be developed. The people also want to be developed so they can get their rights. So let's move on to the first point of clash. Which comes first? Is it the stability of the country and their economic development, or is it their civil rights and their economic development? So Haider came up here and told us people are not going to be able to participate in the society, people are not going to be able to care about things if they don't have their civil and political rights. No, right? Because people care more about how much money they have. People care about if they can have food on the table. People care about lots of other things other than civil and political rights, right? We tell you that countries like the United States, for instance, have been more focused on getting their economy out of the war than they have been about women voting rights, right? We think that we should get people above some sort of minimum. We should give them a minimally good life. Until then, we only focus on development, on economic development. Then we can focus on getting them these rights that they truly deserve. But first, we're going to get you in a good living condition, which just the complete side of opposition thinks it's not necessary. You just have to have the rights. But then they also tell us that when you have the rights, you're more aware, therefore you're going to work better. Also, no, it doesn't work. When you have the rights, you have a lot less bargaining power. There are few reasons why the companies can influence you. And there are few reasons why companies can influence you. We think they can influence you through your ability of not putting food on the table. If you're unable to put food on the table, you don't care about your rights. You don't care about anything. You'll just go and get exploited anyways, because you don't have the money anyways, right? What do you care about the rights? You care about the food. Your survival instinct rules here. Yes, Haider.
Madam, you do realize by having better political laws, that will affect the business laws, and so this will not happen, and people will have food on the table.
Can you restate that? By having?
When you have better political laws and you have better say in the political
yes,
law, it will
this
affect
is
the business
also
law.
another case of confusion, unfortunate confusion. They're unaware that the civil law is how individuals interact with themselves and their governments, versus business law, how the companies should work, how the companies should have their people, how the companies should treat their employees. This is a big problem that we think the companies and the countries need to solve before they get into civil law. And we think that this is not the issue of this debate. And we tell you a few points, right? They tell us that, okay, basically, they tell us that we think you should have civil political rights before you have anything else. And we don't think this is true. And we showed you that civil and political rights do not create the stability that your economic rights create, right? We've told you that an example of India and Pakistan, because people are so diverse, because people are so focused on getting civil rights, because people are so focused on political issues, they're not focusing on what really matters, on getting their company into developed state, and getting themselves better jobs, right? And we think that if we get everybody a good job first, then focus on the political issues, we think this problem is going to be solved, right? We think that when you have the economic foundations, you can have a stronger foundations to build better civil laws, to build better societies. And on to the next point of clash, exploitation and corruption. Where do we think more exploitation and corruption occurs? If we have more civil laws versus if we have a more stable economic foundation. As I have told you in my rebuttals, right? When you have stable economic foundation, when you get people off some sort of a line, when you get people able to have food on their table, you're going to be able to have less corruption, because now your employees are going to have bargaining power. They can choose the companies they want to work for. As Tara has stated, if you don't have food on the table, you're going to work for a company that's going to exploit you anyways, because your priority right now is food. It's not civil and political rights, right? We also tell you that when they tell us, we're going to have civil laws, everything is going to be happy because individuals are going to be aware of the company exploiting them. Yes, and what difference has that made? In Somalia, for instance, in China, for instance, people still go work for Apple because they don't have the food to keep on their table. They're exploited anyway, although they're aware of these rights. So this is clearly a point that they are not taking into consideration, that this doesn't affect your debate as much as the economic stability does. Yes, Elon?
Exactly. So if you're going to have Apple exploit you by having political rights, you have your government to come and intervene.
Yes, and the government is just, yes, and the government is just what? The government is going to protect me, the government is going to be big brother. We don't think this is happening. We don't think this is happening for several reasons, that China is not taking care of their own citizens, blah, 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 blah. We don't think this is the case. We think that the case is that these people are not getting enough income. The government should focus on getting these people enough income so they can focus on not getting exploited and telling Apple, no, Apple, we don't like you anymore. We're going to work for a better company because right now we can afford it, right? We also tell you, finally, where are the people of the countries better off? These are the people we should focus on. And we have told you why we want economic stability. Tara has specifically told you why the economic stability is more valuable. Why is it better for us than the political civil laws? We have told you that because we have less corruption, since we are able to afford the food on our table, we're going to care more about economic values. We have told you that because we're going to have the linkage that we have demonstrated throughout this bench, that civil rights don't come before economic stability, that the US was a perfect example for us, that the US has worked on their economic foundations and then got into stability and problem issues. We believe that this is the model and this is the principle that should work. Get the food on the table, Madam Speaker, and then you can work on your rights.
I'd like to thank the speaker for her speech, call on our final speaker from opposition bench and the debate as a whole, Ms. Arwa Al-Sanosi.
Madam Speaker, yes, we want the better for our society. Why? Because this is what is the government responsibility. Team Proposition here wants to take that burden and put it on the private sector to be its burden to actually guarantee the welfare and the well-being of its citizens. We don't agree. We think that the government should uphold its rights and uphold its duties towards its citizen, Madam Speaker. And that's exactly why I found two main areas of clash in this debate. First being how to ensure economic development in the short and the long run. More importantly, sustainable economical development, which Aylin talked about, which they seem to ignore. And second point of clash, which is what are the outcomes of ensuring civil rights, civil and political rights at hand. Let's start with the importance of sustainability that they seem to ignore. We think that yes, you can get temporary economical development, but that is bad because that would lead to your economy to clash, and more importantly, your economy will collapse and your people will not have rights because you prioritize your economical development. We think that economical development, just like Aylin have said, is not sustainable without full participation. Because then citizens become citizens when they participate and take part of society, when they can vote, when they can actually be the checks and balances that the government needs in the first place to make all these economical concessions and all these economical issues. More importantly, how do they come about? From civil rights, Madam Speaker. Things like education, things like healthcare, things that would actually sustain the economy because we're going to have a better working labor force. But then their whole excuse to that is that, you know what, we care more about them having food on the table, and we don't care about them, having their rights. We think that the key for them to have food on the table is for them to actually have jobs in the first place. How are they going to have jobs in the first place? They said through privatization, and we said no, it's through civil and political rights. Let me tell you 4 things that are bad about privatization. 1, the country's development is the responsibility of the government, and that's its duty towards its citizens. It should never be put towards the private sector because it's not their responsibility, because they will put the human rights at stake because they care about the profit the most, and they don't care about the human rights. They're going to give them minimum wage, which is exactly what they're willing to accept. They're willing to put more people in the labor force for peanuts, for people not to actually get anything. And we think that that is even problematic because that is people who cannot even voice out that these people are actually exploiting me because you know what? They have no civil rights. We think that that is the problem,
Point,
Madam Speaker,
ma'am.
and they're ignoring it. No, thank you. Let me tell you the second problem with privatization. We think that this provides the government with an umbrella to feel people that, look, we're caring about your economical development because somehow, some way, just like Zahra said, it's going to get them Baskin Robbins in the future. We think that that is not going to happen. This is only going to be an umbrella used by the government to actually be more and more corrupt because no one is monitoring them, because it's the responsibility of the private sector, Madam Speaker, and there's no checks and balances because the people have no rights. Third problem with privatization, Madam Speaker, the private sector always include multinational corporations. They are corporations when they have countries that have no rights and no civil records for these people, countries that get away with exploitation. And so long that the people have no rights, they're never going to be able to voice out and never going to be able to actually put important people who actually are going to enable them and care for them.
Arwa.
Tell me why not.
Why is Pakistan, which is a 70% public sector economy, not developed after 60 years of focusing on civil and political rights?
No, thank you, sir. What they do is that they allow minimum wage. They do not put the civil rights of the people. They do not put the civil rights of the people uphold, and they do not think that they're important enough. They allow all of the MCs. They allow exploitation, and we think that that is problematic. So long that you do not. More importantly, it's because of the very corruption that they're trying to prevent. But lastly, let me tell you the fourth problem with privatization, Mr. Speaker. They said privatization, give them to people who can actually take care of the business. Who are the people going to be? Most probably the rich elite who actually already have ties with this corrupt government. So them actually fighting corruption is not going to happen. You're going to put more rich, corrupt people in these private sectors, taking money, channeling money within the government and these elite, and these rich elites, and more corruption. Human have no rights in these countries. They have no food in the table. They have, at best, they have minimum wage, which we think is horrible if they have an alternative of having a sustainable economical development, Mr. Speaker. Now, let me tell you why corruption is going to be bad. They said that the source of corruption, well, they did not agree on a source of corruption, but they said at one point that the source of corruption is the landlords. We think that that is not true. We think that the government owns most of the lands or buy it from the people, and the governments are these same people who are sitting in the parliament, these same people who are going to fight for the 5 years goal, economic goal that is for our benefit. We think that these are the very corrupt people who are going to prevent the economical development from happening. So we think that corruption is going to go through and through their policy, so long that they cannot prove otherwise, Mr. Speaker, and they have failed to prove otherwise. No, thank you, Mr. Now let me tell you about how the outcomes, Madam Speaker, of this policy, or the outcomes of actually ensuring civil rights or being actually on our side. The first one of how what came from opening opposition is that it gives the people the right to voice out, and we think that that is great. They said that it gives them economical growth. We think that is amazing, all through civil factors. But what our extension came about is how this is actually going to create sustainability, how this is going to be better for the developing countries because they rely on investment. That's exactly what Aileen have told you. She said that this would make, when you have more ensured civil rights, the country is more stable. That will attract not only local investors, but international investors as well, as a more of a stable country that allows investment. More importantly, it would view this country as a country that upholds international morals, more of an attractive country for investments and diplomacy. Secondly, it's good for the investors themselves because they're more stable and they can get their profits. And the people who are at the core of this gets their rights, can always voice out against any disadvantage and any exploitation that happens to them because they have their civil rights at heart, Madam Speaker. So because, Madam Speaker, we think that we want to give them the Baskin Robbins that they want, because we think that it's all about sustainable economy, Madam Speaker, it's all about having the outcome, it only happens through civil and political rights.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for a wonderful debate. You can cross the floor, chit-chat a little bit, make some friends. The judges are going to deliberate. I'd like to hand over the floor to Ms. Alberta Stevens. Thank you.